South Africa. The World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance took place between August the 31st and September the 8th, 2001. Unsurprisingly for such an event, under such auspices, the conference was less about tackling racism and intolerance than it was about showcasing these things. The State of Israel came in for particularly virulent attack, to such an extent that some of the Western countries even began to get so uncomfortable about the amount of abuse being levelled at a conference meant to tackle discrimination that the United States and Israel walked out. Other Western countries threatened to walk out, but stayed. The outrages of this conference, which took place under the auspices of the UN, were soon overshadowed by the greater outrages that happened in New York, Washington, D.C., and a field in Pennsylvania just 3 days after the conference ended. But everything that happened in Durban should have been better understood, because every detail of it demonstrated the orgy of anti-Westernism that not only set the scene for 9/11, but had already become the acceptable default position of anti-Westerners around the globe. The self-important declaration that was published at the end of the conference ticked all the right boxes for the various anti-Western powers who made most of the running at the event. Although the anti-Semitism that had run through the conference was downplayed in the final document, it took it as proven that there was no wrong in the world that could not be laid at the West's doors. Every endlessly rehearsed crime of the West was used as the sole explainer for global racism and discrimination. Any and all negative aspects of life in Africa, the Middle East, the Far East and elsewhere were either ignored or put on the West's tab regardless. For instance, the final declaration at Durban pronounced, "We recognize that colonialism has led to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance." It claimed that the African people still suffer the consequences, and that not only should colonialism be condemned, but its reoccurrence should be prevented. Something that African leaders notably failed to do over the following 2 decades as they sold their countries to China's Belt and Road project. Elsewhere, the declaration condemned the transatlantic slave trade, the only such slave trade that was singled out and named. It also called for reparations to be made by the countries that were responsible for these atrocities. In some ways, these conclusions were mild, given the nature of the conference that had led up to the final document, because there had been many highlights in the anti-Western frenzy that was the Durban conference. For instance, there was the sight of Robert Mugabe's government, then terrorizing and murdering white farmers in Zimbabwe, calling on Britain and America to apologize unreservedly for their crimes against humanity. Someone called Matthew Kuhn-Kum, a chief of Canada's First Nations, told the UN delegates that he and his fellow natives were victims of a racist and colonial syndrome of dispossession and discrimination. This went down very well with the delegates. When Mr. Kuhn-Kum claimed that the government in Ottawa had only a year before ordered white mobs to attack the people of the First Nations, a figment of Mr. Kuhn-Kum's imagination, the delegates applauded loudly. Of course, the government being accused of these crimes had paid for Mr. Kuhn-Kum's airfare to go to Durban and make these allegations against the Canadian authorities. But this irony had to join a long queue at Durban. The Syrian foreign minister was among the other progressives who used the conference to make their pitch against the West for its xenophobia and prejudice. The term techno-racism was invented at the conference to try to claim that capitalism was in its essence a racist enterprise. The biggest ovation of all was reserved for Fidel Castro, who was introduced to the conference as the leader of the most democratic country in the world. By 2001, Castro had neglected to hold a free and democratic election in Cuba for 4 decades. But that did not matter to the attendees at Durban. In fact, nothing mattered to them other than attacking the Western democracies, blaming them for all the world's ills, and lauding anyone seen as an enemy or antagonist of the West. Perhaps the only meaningful disagreement at Durban came over who the reparations should be paid to. Various African American attendees thought that reparations should be paid to individuals, whereas, as Mark Stein observed at the time, the African presidents in attendance seemed to believe that it would be more convenient if the West just dropped off one big check at the presidential palace. There was even a moment when the Organization of African Unity stated that reparations for the slaughter of the Tutsi tribe by the Hutu tribe in Rwanda in 1994 should be paid out by the government of America. Rwanda gained its independence from Belgium in 1962. Anyone familiar with the operation of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva will be familiar with this system of values. There, Israel, America, and the European powers are consistently berated for historic crimes by such luminaries of human rights as Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. Most of this can be put down to posturing and distraction techniques, as it was in 2020 when North Korea called the United States a human rights wasteland and a country of extreme racists, citing the BLM protests and the death of George Floyd as justification. It is hard to imagine a country anywhere in the world in which racism is as instilled into the general population as it is in North Korea. As I saw for myself on a visit to the country some years ago, the idea of the racial supremacy of the North Korean peoples is instilled from birth, as is a racialized contempt for Americans, Westerners in general, the Japanese, and many others. It is a country that actively fears miscegenation and has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that North Korean blood is not diluted. International bodies such as the Human Rights Council are perfect places for oppressive states to deflect attention from their own ongoing crimes and focus instead on the historic sins of the West. Most totalitarian and even many non-aligned countries find it useful to cover for each other's abuses in this manner. But just because some claims for reparations are cynical and opportunistic does not mean that all of them are. In recent years, in America in particular, there has been a serious and growing call for some form of reparations to be paid, and it should be seriously considered. These include calls for reparations for the descendants of the victims of empire and reparations for the descendants of those who suffered from the transatlantic slave trade. For many years, these ideas sat on the Fanon-ish edges of the far left. They were regarded as unfeasible, and so hardly worth discussing seriously. Then, in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a cover article for The Atlantic called "The Case for Reparations," that made a serious argument for a historic wealth transfer from one set of racial groups in society to another. In his 15,000-word essay, Coates claimed, Something more than moral pressure calls America to reparations. We cannot escape our history. The history that particularly calls for reparations was the existence of slavery and the Jim Crow laws. His claim was that because black Americans still underperform white Americans in household income, this inequity could be put down to the legacy of racism in the United States. On the point that he did raise, Coates was wildly imprecise about exactly how any such reparation transaction could be carried out. He even claimed that he didn't think that reparations could be achieved. But the essay changed the weather around the discussion. In fact, 5 years later, the New Yorker said that the article had changed the world, not least by making reparations a major subject of debate among Democratic presidential candidates. Portions of the left across the West also picked up the theme. In a short time, the subject of reparations moved from being politically unfeasible to politically credible. In Britain, the 2019 Labour Party manifesto committed Her Majesty's opposition to conduct an audit of the impact of Britain's colonial legacy. The resulting 234-page investigation into the British state, published by the Labour Party in 2021, declared that Britain should make an unreserved apology to all of the countries of the world that the Empire invaded and negatively impacted, and that the British state should set up a reparations fund to communities across the world that can show loss and detriment as a result of the actions of the British state. In America, the issue came even closer to the political centre, and it makes the demands of the British Labour Party look straightforward. For it is in the United States that the talk of a wealth transfer is not about an international money transfer, but a transfer of wealth from one set of racial groups within the country to another. The Democratic contenders for the presidential nomination in 2020 talked about it. And one of President Biden's first acts in office in February 2021 was to give his support to Democratic lawmakers attempting to pass legislation that would create a commission to examine slavery in the United States and its ongoing effects and to look into possible remedies. The possible remedies listed included financial payments from the government to the descendants of slaves to compensate them for unpaid labor carried out by their ancestors. Wittingly or otherwise, such people and U.S. authorities are dealing with a question deeper than they realize. In his Atlantic piece on reparations, Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about German reparations to Israel as a type of model for what reparations might look like in the United States. Since he, too, chose to employ a World War II parallel, perhaps a tale from the same period might be used to exemplify the depth of the problem that any discussion about reparations must deal with. In 1969, the Holocaust survivor and celebrated post-war Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal published a work called The Sunflower, on the possibilities and limits of forgiveness. It is an account of something that Wiesenthal says happened to him at the Lemberg concentration camp. In 1943, Wiesenthal was one of a group of forced labourers, and one day is plucked from the line and taken to the bedside of a Nazi soldier who is dying. The man, called Karl S. in the book, turns out to have joined the Hitler Youth, and from there moved up the Nazi ranks all the way to the SS. During this time, he participated in one particular atrocity. He confesses to the Jewish man at his bedside that his unit had at one stage in the war destroyed a house in which there were around 300 Jews. The SS unit had set the house on fire, and as the Jews inside tried to escape from the burning building by leaping from the windows, Karl S. and his comrades shot and killed them all. This is described in considerable detail, and if this was all the Sunflower was, then it would simply be yet one more tale of the countless number of tales of Nazi atrocities carried out against Jews during World War II. But Wiesenthal's book is not about that. It is about what happens next. Because it is clear that Karl has asked for a Jew to be brought to his bedside because he wants to confess to this crime in particular, and to a Jew in particular. Because he wants to get this particular atrocity off his chest before his imminent death. It is something in the way of a deathbed confession. And it is what happens next that makes Wiesenthal's book so memorable. For, after the SS soldier has finished his tale, and the reader perhaps expects some type of reconciliation, Wiesenthal gets up and leaves the room without saying a word. Later, Wiesenthal meditates on whether he did the right thing, and the second half of the book is given over to a symposium involving a range of thinkers and religious leaders who contributed their thoughts on the events that Wiesenthal has described. It is noticeable, incidentally, that many of the Christians who contributed to this symposium believed that Wiesenthal should have offered some kind of forgiveness to the soldier. But the broader consensus that emerges from the contributors is that Wiesenthal did the right thing. And if there is a reason that this comes down to, it is this: that Wiesenthal, although he was a Jew, like the soldiers' victims, had neither the right nor the ability to forgive the soldier for what he had done. In order for true forgiveness to occur, the parties involved must be not only the one who has done the wrong, but the one to whom the wrong has been done. Wiesenthal may have been a Jew like the victims, but he does not have the right to forgive on behalf of his fellow Jews who were gunned down by the soldier as they jumped from a burning building. Wiesenthal is not these men, women, and children. He is not even a close relative of these men, women, and children. These victims may never have wanted to forgive their killers. Perhaps they would have hated their killers forever and not wanted them to die in peace. The SS soldier had participated in such a terrible end for them. So what right did Wiesenthal have to say on behalf of all of these people that the SS soldier is forgiven? Why should the SS soldier die with even a part of his conscience cleared, after taking no care about the consciences of so many other human beings? Within this is a very powerful and important point, almost totally lost in the debate about forgiveness in the modern world. In recent years, the prime ministers of countries including Australia, Canada, the United States, and Britain have all issued apologies for historic wrongs. Sometimes, as when the direct victims of these wrongs are still alive, this can ameliorate suffering and provide a form of closure for the victims. But when we are talking about apologies for things done centuries ago, we enter a different ethical territory. In such cases, neither the people claiming to be victims nor the people assuming the mantle of perpetrators are any such thing. When it comes to apologies for the slave trade or for colonialism, we are talking about political leaders and others making apologies for things that happened before they themselves were born, and apologizing to people who have not suffered these wrongs themselves, though some may be able to point to some disadvantage they can claim to have suffered as a result of these historic actions. Any apology begins to consist of people who may or may not be descended from people who may have done some historic wrong, apologizing to people who may or may not be descended from people who had some wrong done to them. In the realm of reparations, this becomes messier still. For at this stage, the divide in the West is by no means clearly between victims and perpetrators. Whereas the governments in almost every non-Western country are strikingly ethnically homogeneous, consider the political leadership in India, China, or South Africa, governments in every Western country are now made up of people of a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds. No Western cabinet would be able to work out the victim-oppressor divide even at the table around which they sit. Nor would any political party. Just consider the difficulty merely of working out what Elizabeth Warren may or may not be owed. The issue of reparations now comes down not to descendants of one group paying money to descendants of another group. Rather, it comes down to people who look like the people to whom a wrong was done in history, receiving money from people who look like the people who may have done the wrong. It is hard to imagine anything more likely to rip apart a society than attempting a wealth transfer based on this principle. Perhaps that is why the difficult questions on this are ignored by everybody who has argued for reparations to occur. For instance, were any such scheme to operate in America, the country would have to carefully determine which racial groups in the country have been most harmed by American history. It may determine to limit the scope of its attention solely to the issue of people who are the descendants of slaves, though there is no reason why it should limit itself to that. But if it did, then the prelude to reparations would have to be the development of a societal genetic database. It could be that this would only be necessary to create for the black population of the United States. It would then have to determine how to apportion the funds available. Anyone who thinks voter ID laws or vaccines are intrusive should prepare for the questions that will follow this process. For instance, after the genetic database is created, it will have to be decided whether or not the only recipients should be those who are 100% descended from slaves, if any such people can be identified. Should these people alone be given a full stipend? Should someone who is only descended from slaves on their mother's side receive 50% of the same sum? Will the restitution process try to operate the one-drop rule? And if so, how will it ensure that nobody is taking advantage of the financial spigots that would result? And of course, all of this would be predicated on the idea that a vast wealth transfer from one racial group to another racial group in America in the 2020s will bring racial harmony and will not cause any igniting or resurgence of racial ill-feeling. Can anyone be sure that this is the most likely result? Only around 14% of the US population is black. As of 2019, more than half of that population, 59%, were millennials or younger, that is, under the age of 38. During their lifetime, it has been illegal to treat people differently because of their skin color. Jim Crow laws were decades in the past before this group was born. The official prohibition on the further importing of slaves into the United States had been signed 2 centuries before this group was born. To begin to apply reparations to this community would require a clear differentiation between black Americans who are descendants of Africans brought forcibly to the United States and black Americans whose ancestors voluntarily came to the United States in the centuries after slavery was abolished. And what about the people doing the paying? There will be many people who have come to America's shores since slavery ended, most of America's Jewish, Asian, and Indian populations, for instance, who may make an objection at this point. Why should those whose ancestors played no part in a wrong be made to forfeit a part of their tax dollars in paying for something that happened generations before their family came to America? Should people whose ancestors died in the Civil War fighting for the North get any special dispensation? Should those whose ancestors fought for the South pay disproportionately more? There are very obvious reasons why people might call for reparations, for political convenience, or in genuinely seeking to right a historic wrong. But there is an equally obvious reason why they can almost never be drawn into giving any details of what the process might look like. That is because it is an organizational and ethical nightmare. We also know that no matter how much is done to address the issue, it will never be enough. We know this, not least, because Britain's attempt to make up for the slave trade is over 2 centuries in the past, and the issue of further reparations being made is still raised. Indeed, the subject is discussed as though critics either do not know, or know and do not care, how many resources Britain poured into abolishing slavery in the 1800s. The British taxpayer paid a hefty